So I'm Susan Herman from Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about the EpiPort Clinical Research Curriculum, about research administration. So some of the day-to-day activities that you need to do in order to keep your research organized, and it will include a discussion of IRBs, case report forms, databases, budgets, and regulatory documentation. So we have several objectives for this lecture. I'm going to be talking about assembling an appropriate research team, understanding the process of obtaining an IRB approval, describing the components of standard operating procedures, manuals of operations, and regulatory binders, selecting appropriate computer hardware and software for study database management, designing paper or electronic case report forms that are useful and efficient, developing a research grant budget and budget justification, and then developing appropriate data and safety monitoring plans and data sharing plans. So this is going to be an overview. You have some supplemental materials that will include links to websites that have more detailed information. And I also provided some supplementary materials going over in more detail some of the aspects of the lecture today. So I first want to start off by giving an overview of the regulatory and operational tasks that are involved in clinical research. And I divided this into specific study time points. And as you're going through and developing your timeline for your clinical research project, there are specific tasks that need to be done at each stage. And I broke these down into several different areas: assembling your team, looking at the process of developing your research proposal, finding appropriate resources, collecting and analyzing your data, maintaining the quality of your study, meeting regulatory requirements, making sure that your institutional review board documentation is up to date, and then budget and financial information. So we'll first start off by looking at developing your project, where you'll identify a mentor and potential collaborators, assess the feasibility and any potential barriers to development of your project, obtain statistical support, get feedback from collaborators on your aims and your project scope, start doing your human subjects training for yourself and your co-investigators and research team, determining IRB requirements, and starting to think about what you'll need in terms of funding and developing your budget. So that's really as you're starting to develop your project. Next, as you're designing your study, you'll start hiring your study team members and define the roles that they'll have in the study process. You'll create a project timeline and milestones, and you can use this set of slides to actually help develop your timeline. You'll create a data management core and decide how you're going to be collecting your research information. You'll submit your study for scientific review and get feedback from your review people about how, any modifications that you need to make to the study protocol. You'll also start looking at standard operating procedures for your institution and make sure that you and all of your staff know how to follow these standard operating procedures. We'll talk more about this in a second. You'll complete and submit your IRB application and begin developing your budget. Then once you start the study, you'll train your study personnel and set up your record keeping. You'll determine what sort of research space and other materials that you'll need to complete your project. You'll choose your database and data entry system, create your case report forms and other data collection tools, prepare your manual of operations, which is a detailed guide to your study processes, get final IRB approval, and then finalize your funding and budget. And then as you go through and conduct the study and look at your study results, you want to continue to have study team meetings where you'll be going over the performance of the trial, assessing how you're doing in terms of your project timeline and milestones, modifying any procedures that are not working well. You'll collect your data and maintain security, have ongoing assessment of your data quality, and then keep up with your regulatory documentation and any required paperwork for your IRB. Financially, you'll monitor expenses and payments. And then study results is the process of, closing the study to new data and beginning to actually do the analysis. So you'll, again, meet with your study team to discuss the analysis plan. You'll start doing the data analysis and writing your manuscript. You'll make sure that your regulatory documents and IRB are all up to date for closing the study and still monitor your expenses. And then study closure is basically just going through and finalizing all of your information from a regulatory and IRB and financial closeout point of view. So we'll talk in more detail about some of these tasks, which it would be helpful to have more details. So the first step is to assemble and train an appropriate research team. The first step is often to find a research mentor. So this will be an experienced clinical researcher or a principal investigator in your group who can help you to develop your research skills. The mentor will be both an advisor and a supporter, but will also be able to coach you in any areas where you might not have the appropriate skills and be honest and help you critique how you're doing in terms of study performance. And when you're choosing your research mentor, you want to consider several factors, including what the research expertise of the mentor is, both in terms of the research type, the content. So is this somebody who's doing translational research or clinical research or epidemiologic research? And then also the detailed content of the research. For example, is this research in genetics of epilepsy or in EEG methods? So you may need more than one mentor in order to complete your research project. It's also very helpful to have a mentor who has a lot of experience in performing clinical research from an administrative and operational point of view. All of the things that I'm talking about today, it can be quite overwhelming to think about starting up a research project independently, and having someone to help with that can be very useful. You also want to consider the research mentor's personality and mentoring style and make sure that you're compatible because hopefully this will be a long-term relationship throughout your career. And you also want to look at whether the mentor has a history of successfully mentoring other investigators. You'll do a similar process in choosing your collaborators, and you want to look for people who have expertise required for performance of your study that you yourself do not possess, or who have resources that are necessary to complete your project and are willing to share those resources with you. Now, there's a lot of places that you can look for mentors and collaborators, including within your own division and department. This will include both faculty members, but also experienced study staff. Research nurses and experienced study coordinators can be really, really helpful in terms of the administrative parts of research. Many hospitals have clinical research centers who have staff who can help you, again, particularly in the administrative part of developing a research project. Again, most institutions have research profile sites where you can actually go online and put in expertise and search for faculty who have clinical or research expertise in a particular area. And this is particularly true in centers that have CTSA programs, Clinical and Translational Science Awards, because they usually have very detailed information about research profiles of all of the faculty at the institution. NeuroNext also has a mentoring program and collaborators, and this can be helpful. They have a searchable site there. And you can also find mentors and collaborators outside your institution through the American Epilepsy Society, the American Academy of Neurology, and the Child Neurology Society. So first, you really want to work on assembling your research team, hiring a study coordinator, potentially a study nurse, getting your collaborators involved in the project. And then you need to train your study team. And training involves both general research training, so this will be making sure that your studies are in compliance with the operating procedures of your institution. We'll talk more about that in a second. But then you also want to train the study team on study-specific procedures so that they know how to do all of the technical work that's involved in your research protocol. Again, there are some resources often in your department that you can reach out to help train your research team. And then CRCs and your clinical trials office can be very helpful in developing training for your study team. And then as the study progresses, you want to monitor your team's performance and compare how you're doing to your timeline, to your standard operating procedures and manual of procedures. And this is generally done by having collaborative team meetings on a regular basis and keeping detailed meeting minutes of the progress of the trial. So effective research teams have defined roles and responsibilities so that each member of the team knows what they're expected to do and when they need to do it. They have appropriate time and space and financial support for the role in your project, and it is really important as you're planning your study to make sure that you do have all of these appropriate support for your research team. You also want to have realistic timelines and milestones and be measuring your study continuously against this timeline. And then for your co-investigators who will be participating in analysis and publication of your results, it's very good to begin talking about expectations in terms of manuscript contributions as well as authorship requirements. So this is just a list of research team members that you may want to consider including on your team. Not every research study requires all of these people, and at times there are one person who may carry out many of these roles. So this ranges from your principal investigator and co-investigators to the project director, someone who's recruiting patients, a research nurse, an assistant, someone who does quality control, your data manager, your statistician, someone to provide project management and administrative support, someone to help prepare the budget, and someone to help with hiring and staff management. And as you begin as a junior investigator, unfortunately, your research team often looks like this, where you are the main person doing all of these research roles. But as you develop your projects and begin to do more ambitious clinical research, you will be able to hopefully bring in additional team members so that you're not performing all of these roles yourself. I mentioned before that you'll need to train your staff, so some of the most important training is human subject training. And many institutions are now using the CITI initiative, so the Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative. This is the most widely used online education program, and a certificate of human subject training is required for each study team member before they can actually start working on your research project. And most of the time, your IRB will require that people be certified in biomedical human subjects research. Sometimes, if you're doing industry-sponsored trials, to be certified in good clinical practice, conflicts of interest, and responsible conduct of research. And this is often required for NIH or NSF grants. And then your institution will also likely have institution-specific training for new principal investigators and study staff. And this is your introduction to your institution's specific standard operating procedures. And then finally, once you've developed your study techniques, you'll need to train all of your study team members in the study-specific policies and procedures. All right, so the next step in your research project is to obtain IRB approval. So IRB is required for any research that involves human subjects. So research is defined as a systematic investigation that includes development, testing, and evaluation that's designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. And human subjects are living individuals in whom an investigator conducting research obtains data through intervention or interaction with the subject, or has access to identifiable private information. And your IRB will have guidance about what constitutes human subjects research and the methods for you to determine with the IRB whether your protocol actually requires IRB review. Many of the IRBs have navigators or other administrative staff who can assist you in determining the requirements for IRB at your institution. And there's generally 3 levels of review. So exempt, it doesn't meet the requirements in the prior slide and is not considered to be human subjects research, does not require IRB approval. Next, there's expedited review, where there are the study is minimal risk, and the IRB does a review with a subset of the IRB members rather than a full board review. And again, your IRB will have guidance about what constitutes minimal risk and is eligible for expedited review. This is generally research which reviews already existing data or is looking at general medical procedures that are commonly done in clinical practice and have a low risk. And then full board review is required for studies that pose more than minimal risk. So these are prospective treatment studies where there may be risks to the subject that need to be fully analyzed by the full board. The IRB will also have specific requirements for investigational agents, so investigational new drugs and investigational devices have specific requirements for IRB submission, and so you'll need to become familiar with this, and I have some resources in the supplemental materials that you can use to explore investigational new drug and investigational device requirements. And then once the IRB reviews your protocol, they will either approve it with some areas that need to be addressed before you begin the study, require that you make revisions and resubmit for re-review, or disapprove the research project. So there are some differences between the protocol that you submit to the IRB and the grant proposal that you originally wrote to describe your research project and to obtain funding. So the grant proposal is really a scientific document. The general purpose is to obtain funding, so this will go to an organization or philanthropy or a government organization who will approve the research and fund your research project. And the focus of this is really on the aims and the hypotheses and the methods of the research project. They're very interested in looking at the feasibility of the project in terms of cost and staffing and equipment. And the review is done by a scientific review committee and funders of your project. And generally, in the grant proposal, you're trying to be persuasive and make a good case that your project deserves funding. On the other hand, the IRB protocol or the detailed study protocol is a regulatory document, and the goal of this is to describe your study in detail so that the reviewers can determine what the possible risks and benefits of the study are. The focus is on the specific objectives of the study and the details of all of the study procedures. And in terms of feasibility, they're looking at whether you're likely to be able to enroll subjects and whether you have the resources and the skills to appropriately implement and carry out the research project. The review is generally done by the sponsor and by the IRB at your institution. And the tone of the IRB proposal is informative and detailed, really detailed information about all of the study activities. So the protocol, as defined by the ICH guidelines, is a document that describes the objectives, design, methodology, statistical considerations, and organization of a trial. And there are a list of required components for the protocol. The protocol is written either by the sponsor, if this is an industry-sponsored trial, or by the investigator or the team, if this is an investigator-initiated trial. And there should be input from all of the team members based on their expertise, so statisticians, data managers, study coordinators, etc. And the protocol also includes a statement of compliance, which is a signed statement by the principal investigator that the study will be conducted in compliance with the protocol, good clinical practice, and any applicable regulatory requirements. And each institution's IRB generally requires specific templates for developing the protocol and may have required and suggested language for describing some components of the research project. So the protocol components include the title and the protocol number, the version number, the date, and the list of investigators who are responsible for the study. And then the actual protocol itself includes a summary of the protocol, a schedule of events, so exactly what happens throughout your study, and then the detailed protocol itself. I'm not going to go over this in great detail. It'll be available in your supplemental materials, but you can see that there are multiple components that are required for the study protocol and the IRB protocol, including details of the study design, the study population, all of the study visit procedures, how you're going to do your safety assessments, a statistical and data management plan, a risk-benefit analysis, ethics and informed consent, and then how you're going to do quality control and assurance. So there are more details about how to develop this protocol in the supplemental materials. And then with the IRB application, you also have to submit other documentation, including examples of your informed consent, a list of all of your research personnel. You may need other approvals from people in your institution, like pharmacy or nursing or radiology, and then conflict of interest disclosures for all of your study team members. If this is a sponsored protocol, an industry-sponsored protocol, you'll need to provide the original protocol from the sponsor, the investigator's drug or device brochure, which provides an overview of all of the research that's been done with that investigational agent in the past, a Hipaa authorization or request for waiver of Hipaa, so this is privacy information that's also required for research participants, samples of your recruitment materials. If you're going to be obtaining consent over the phone, you'll need to provide samples of telephone scripts that you'll use for consent, and then any questionnaires or survey instruments that you're going to be using in the study, and any case report forms that are going to be used. And then once the IRB has approved your protocol, there are some other tasks that may be required, and these include any amendments to the protocol. So if you have to modify the protocol at all, those modifications need to be approved by the IRB before you can incorporate them into your study procedures. You'll need to update the IRB if there are any adverse events, and in particular if there are any serious adverse events. If there are any problems with your performance of the study, so if you do not follow the protocol, or if there are any violations of the protocol, or any other incidents that interfere with the performance of the study. Once a year, you'll have to provide a continuing review, which is an update on the number of subjects who have been recruited, a summary of the adverse events and the study findings. And then finally, at the end of the study, you'll need an IRB study closeout report. And so the IRB has a lot of components that are required for initial approval, but then there are continuing requirements that you need to pay attention to as you perform your study over time. Next, we're going to talk about regulatory documentation, and this will include standard operating procedures, manual of procedures, and regulatory binders. Unfortunately, this is not the most exciting part of clinical research, but it really is an incredibly important part of study management and will help to ensure that you're performing your study according to legal and regulatory requirements. So the regulations and the guidelines come from two main sources. The first is the Department of Health and Human Services in the Office for Human Research Protection, and this is called CFR 45 Part 46. And then there are also requirements from the Food and Drug Administration for studies that may be used for labeling of a new investigational agent, and this is defined in CFR 21, and the parts are listed here. And then guidance comes from ICH Good Clinical Practice. So this is the International Conference on Harmonization, and it's a detailed description of the technical requirements that are used internationally for developing new investigational agents for human use. And it has both ethical guidelines as well as scientific quality guidelines for all phases of development of investigational agents. So you'll have guidance from ICH as well as from OHRP and FDA. So with your regulatory documentation, you'll have three different types of documentation. So the first are standard operating procedures, and these describe the general roles and responsibilities of the clinical research staff and general policies and procedures. So these are usually maintained by your human subjects research group in your institution, and they're across the entire institution. An example would be processes for reporting adverse events or recommendations for documentation of the informed consent process. So these standard operating procedures apply to all clinical research activities within your institution, and an essential part of training is for you to be familiar with your institution's SOPs. The next type of documentation is your Manual of Operations and Procedures, which is called a MOP or a MOOP or a Manual of Operations, just MOO, and this is specific to your study. So it may include some of the same information in the standard operating procedures, but rather than just describing this in general, it will say, this is how our team is going to document adverse events. These are the staff who are required to make the adverse event documentation. These are the people who are going to have to review the adverse events. This is the list of entities that we need to report adverse events to, including your own IRB or the sponsor or other regulatory bodies. So it really is study-specific. It describes the training that's required for all of your staff, as well as the details of all of the procedures that will be done in your study. And optimally, this would allow a new staff member to get up to speed very quickly and ensure that all of your procedures are being done the same. If your study coordinator changes, or if you have multiple study coordinators working with subjects on different days, that all of the procedures will be done in a standardized way. And then finally, you'll have a regulatory binder, and this is the way that you show that you are compliant with standard operating procedures and your manual of operations and procedures. So this is documentation of all of the steps required for good clinical practice. So as I mentioned before, SOPs are uniformly written, usually across an institution or research enterprise, and they follow or outline the steps that are required to meet institutional, state, and federal requirements for research. And as I said before, this is usually developed by your Human Subjects Protection Office in conjunction with your IRB. And there are several components to an SOP. It describes the purpose of the SOP, what the scope is, so how many people this applies to, who's responsible for carrying out the SOP, detailed description of the procedure, an outline of when these were reviewed or revised, what happens if the procedures are not followed, a list of references, and then sometimes documentation and attachments. Most IRBs and Human Subjects Protection's Office will have a website where there's a list of all of the SOPs for your institution. Here's an example of a standard operating procedure from the NeuroNext network, and this is case report form development. You can see here. So it gives the title, the version number, replaces a previous version, what the effective date is, a description of the policy and the scope, and then the roles and the responsibilities. So these are all written in a very standardized format and generally are, as I said, available on a website or in a central binder so that these research procedures are carried out in a standardized fashion. So common standard operating procedures cover a wide range of research activities from training for good clinical practice to how you maintain your source documentation, to how you report adverse events, how you process samples. So your institution may have a much larger list of standard operating procedures, but they generally cover these broad areas of research practice. And this is also in your supplementary materials. All right. So once you've developed your standard or learned about your standard operating procedures, then you can use those to help develop your manual of operations and procedures, which, again, is a very detailed list of all of your study activities. So there'll be an overview, a list of all of the people involved in the study, both at your own institution and if this is multi-center across other institutions, descriptions of the roles and the responsibilities of all of the staff in the study, a detailed description of how patients are recruited and enrolled, activities at each visit, if this is a randomized study, how that is achieved and how patients and providers are blinded. So you can see that this is matching very closely with the Irb protocol, but it includes much more detail about exactly how to carry out each of these different areas. So it's a recipe for how to do all of the activities involved in your trial. And then finally, the regulatory binder is a template for tracking the documentation associated with studies involving human subjects. And again, this is usually developed by your Office for Human Subjects Research and the IRB, and it helps you to maintain all of the regulatory information that's required. This is particularly important for studies that are sponsored and for investigational agents that are going to be submitted to the FDA for approval for clinical use. So the sections include both regulatory documentation, general information about organization and record keeping, and then references to other federal regulations. In your supplemental materials, there's a list of all of the tabs that are required for the regulatory binder, but I want you all to stay awake, and so I'm not going to list those right now. So all of these documents help you to maintain the quality of your research project. So the team members who are involved in your study should review all of the protocols and standard operating procedures and MOPs as they're developed. You should test all of your case report forms and equipment and procedures and do some dry runs to make sure that you work out all of the kinks before you finalize your documentation. And then as you're performing the study, you should do intermittent audits of how the procedures are being carried out and make sure that they match what's described in your manual of procedures, both in terms of training, making sure that procedures are standardized, that equipment is working and calibrated appropriately, looking at the performance of your staff, et cetera. As I mentioned before, team meetings are really important for monitoring study performance. You should keep structured minutes of all of your meetings and require that your study staff attend the meetings. And you'll talk about at each study meeting the recruitment, whether there's any additional training, the performance of the study in terms of any issues that come up, and then you'll assign activities for people to complete, and you'll follow up at the next meeting. Study performance also involves reviewing the performance of your staff, intermittently looking at interim data reports and making sure that the data quality is good. Many institutions have templates for self-auditing so that you can actually go through and look at your documentation and make sure that you're doing all of your procedures in adherence to your study protocols. And then there are also sometimes institutional audits. Many institutions will perform periodic audits using these templates to see how research teams are performing within the institution, and this can be not for cause, which means it's just a standard part of the research operations of the institution, or there can be for cause audits where there's been a protocol deviation or a violation which alerts the Human Subjects Protection Office that there may be a problem, and then your research procedures will be reviewed by them. So the next part of the study, of the lecture, is to talk about selection of a database and management of your data collection instruments. Your data for your study will generally be stored in a database. This is generally going to be electronic and will allow you to look at your data, assess whether there are any missing data elements, monitor the ongoing performance of your trial, reformat your data for statistical analysis, and some databases even help you to collect some of the administrative data that's required for the performance of your trial. And when you're looking for a data management system, there are several different factors to consider. This will include how easy it is to enter information into the database, how complex your data is and how many case reports forms that you have, the number of variables that you're going to be collecting, what type of data you're collecting and what are the requirements for data security, and then finally what the cost of the data management system is. So when you're developing your data plan, you'll develop a data dictionary, which will include all of the information that you're collecting, generally organized in tables, and then describes all of the variables that you collect for the study, including the name of the variable, the definition of the variable, permissible values for the data that is entered, instructions for people on how to enter the data, sometimes references to where the data variable was developed, validation review rules, and any potential coded responses. And I'll show you later some examples of some systems for developing data dictionaries. Now, data management can be done sometimes in flat files, so this includes things like Microsoft Excel spreadsheets, or Google Drive spreadsheets. The problems with these are they're somewhat difficult to protect. It's easy to override or delete data. Data analysis can be a little bit cumbersome, and it's really only, these formats are really only appropriate for fairly simple studies where you have one or just a couple of visits where you're entering information. Some statistical software allows you to develop forms for collection of data, but these are generally fairly limited and, again, would only be appropriate for studies that have limited data entry. Some other options include online data capture systems. One of the most commonly used is something called REDCap, which is Research Electronic Data Capture. And this is the website. This is a free, secure web application that was designed to build and manage online surveys and research databases. And it has a lot of very nice features that allow you to develop case report forms and data dictionaries, et cetera, on your own without a lot of cost. Some of the nice features are that it has audit trails so that the data is tracked and users can be managed online, and anyone manipulating the data or changing the data is tracked automatically. There's export to multiple different formats, including Excel and statistical packages for analysis. There's a built-in project calendar and a scheduling module if you have prospective visits that your subjects need to keep. There are ways to export the data and get a reporting tool so you can look at, the numbers of subjects you have enrolled and the number of visits that have been completed, et cetera. There are some advanced features that allow you to create case report forms and questionnaires that have branching logic or that do calculations on your data as you enter it. It's compliant with HIPAA and the FDA requirements for data security, and it runs on multiple different types of operating systems. And again, this, if your institution participates in REDCap, your institution will generally have a team that can help you build the database and provide some support for use of the database at little to no cost. Then there are relational databases. So some desktop options include Microsoft Access or FileMaker. More expensive relational database systems like Oracle and SQL Server, MySQL. These start getting a little bit expensive and can require a significant amount of know-how in order to plan this, and you may need a database developer in order to work in these systems. There's also another web-based database called StudyTracks, which can manage multiple studies and has it embedded workflow and task management. It's similar to REDCap, but is not a free system. And then this is just a list of some other web-based databases that are generally used in industry-sponsored trials because they're relatively expensive. So data integrity is a really critical component of your project. The level of testing for data integrity depends on the source of the funding and how the data is ultimately going to be used. So for a single center, low-risk observational study, the level of testing will be fairly low. But if you have a study that's going to be used for FDA submission, this needs to be much more detailed in terms of data integrity and validation because of the risks involved in the trials. Generally, you'll want to test your database with some dummy data before you send it out for general use. And you want to have some procedures for data validation if the data is not in the correct format, or if there's missing data, have some system for being able to assess that and improve the quality of the data. And then you'll also want to be able to have intermittent reports on study progress for studies that are prospective and have multiple visits over time. Data confidentiality and security is really important. So your data will have site and subject coded IDs. You should try not to share personally identifiable data, and there are additional security requirements if you do have any personally identifiable data. Your database should be password protected, and you should be able to define the levels of data access by the role of the person using the database. If there's an audit trail, that's incredibly helpful. You'll also need to have procedures for backup and storage of your data. And again, your institution likely has a research IT team that can help you to explore the different options for data collection and security. All right, the next phase is to look at case report forms. So case report forms are the official data recording documents for clinical research, and they collect all of the relevant data in a specific format that's in accordance with your study protocol and in compliance with regulatory requirements. So as you're developing your case report forms, you're going to first make a list of the variables that you want to collect for your study. And this will include baseline information, predictors, outcomes of interest, and potential confounders. And you'll do sort of an assessment of the instruments that are already available, and then assemble a list of questions or instruments that you might be able to use for your study. And I'll give you some examples of this in a couple of slides. So once you've sort of collected potential instruments, you'll want to review those and figure out which are most appropriate for your trial or your study. And using something that's already available saves time and also facilitates comparison of your results to previously published information. You need to be aware, though, that some instruments are copyrighted, and you need to get permission for use of these tools in your own study. If necessary, you may need to add some questions or revise the instrument a little bit, but keep in mind that if you do that, you may actually make the instrument less valid than the original instrument. If there is no appropriate data collection form, then you may need to develop one on your own. And then you want to sort of get the most concise set of instruments and variables possible. So you don't want to collect data that is not important to look at the outcomes in your study. You really want to have a very concise set of questions, both in terms of efficiency of doing the study, but also in terms of cost. So as I said, collect only the data that's required for analysis. Make sure that this is in a standardized format and that you don't have any duplicate questions. You really want to try to have forced choices rather than free text responses, because these are much easier to analyze statistically. You want to provide detailed instructions to the people filling out the form to make sure that the forms are filled out correctly, and then make sure that all of the options are available for each of your questions. So generally, there are a few different types of CRFs. There's usually CRFs that collect demographic information. Then you'll collect information about whether the subject is eligible and some additional information about enrollment. There's often information collected about general medical, family, and social history. And then you'll collect information about your specific disease of interest. For example, the type of epilepsy, the date of onset of epilepsy, the specific seizure types, etc. And then in terms of your outcomes, you'll collect information about safety and then information about efficacy. So let's look at some examples of this. Each CRF, each case report form, will have some identifying information in the header, and then in the footer, information about who completed the form, when it was completed, and the date reviewed. So here's an example. So this was a EEG study that we had done looking at continuous EEG after traumatic brain injury. So the name of the subject study, the subject ID, their initials, and this was an inclusion-exclusion checklist the date it was filled out, our checklist to make sure that the patients met the inclusion and didn't meet the exclusion criteria, and then I cut off the bottom where it had the signature information for who completed the form. Safety modules generally come from, a standard set of information, for example, vital signs or physical exam findings, a list of concomitant medications, collection information for adverse events, and what happens to the patient at the end of the study in terms of outcome. Efficacy modules are a little less standardized because they're developed, based on the aims of your particular research project. And so these are sometimes more difficult to develop, and you may have a range of different instruments that you can choose from. Here's an example of a really great resource for developing your case report forms. This is the NINDS Common Data Elements project. And so NINDS convenes several committees to develop clinical research common data elements in multiple disease areas in neurology. And you can see a list here: ALS, cerebral palsy, Chiari malformations, epilepsy. And for each of these areas, there's a list of suggested variables and instruments to use. And these are freely available on the NINDS website. So let's get a little more detail about this. So this is a classification of etiology form from the Epilepsy Common Data Elements Bank. So it gives you a list of all of the variables and a form that can be appropriate for paper-based data collection. And there are also data definition tables that can be imported into databases for electronic data capture. And these include both standard disease information as well as suggested outcome measurements, for example, quality of life and seizure frequency and other variables. So these common data elements reduce the time and the cost needed to develop data collection tools, make sure that studies collect information in a consistent manner, improve the data quality, and facilitate data sharing. And then because you're using a standardized set of common data elements, it facilitates comparison across trials, meta-analyses, et cetera, and increases the availability of data for the planning and design of new trials. So NIH grants strongly encourage use of these common data elements in any grant applications. The CDEs include core information, which is across all diseases, highly recommended CDEs, and then some exploratory CDEs. And then the modules organize the CDEs for data collection. I encourage you to go to the CDE site and explore that so that you're familiar with what's available there. And there are some other data collection tools that are also freely available through NIH. So there's the NIH Toolbox, which allows you to collect neurobehavioral information on an iPad. There's the PROMIS system, so Patient-Reported Outcomes Measurement Information System, which has person-centered measures across a variety of domains. And these are available both in paper format as well as electronic forms and can often be integrated into your study database. And then finally, there's the Quality of Life in Neurological Disorders, or NeuroQOL, which looks at both pediatric and adult outcomes in neurologic disorders. So again, in your supplemental materials, you have links to all of these resources, and I encourage you to explore those. You can improve the data quality and your study performance by including instructions in your CRF. So here's an example of a consent document where there's actually a checklist for all of the things that you need to do as part of informed consent to make sure that your study staff actually perform each of the required procedures. So this can be really helpful. making sure that your study meets all of the requirements. And again, you can have some flow sheets. So, for example, here you can actually look at whether the enrollment was confirmed, whether the research pharmacy was notified, et cetera. So you can give cues in your CRFs about the next step for the study. You can also have checklists for required study decisions. So is this person ready to exit the study? If they meet any of these, then the patient exits. So it helps in decision-making and in standardization of your study performance. There are several other types of data collection instruments. So diaries are ways to track events that vary from day to day, and these can either be on paper or electronic. You should remember that the act of tracking information on a regular basis can actually make people change their behavior, and so that's something you need to consider in the design of your trial. Electronic diaries may be more accurate, and because people are documenting information much closer to the time that an event of interest occurs, and they may remember the details of the event a little bit better. And there may also be timestamps to confirm when the data was actually entered. We can also have questionnaires that are completed by patients and administered in a variety of methods as part of your study. Online survey tools are a common study technique, and there's a list here of different types of online study instruments, including REDCap and a variety of other forms that you can use to collect information from your study participants. And then finally, there are direct measurements of patient information, so vital signs, lab tests, EEGs, et cetera. And these direct measurements often require some coding or interpretation before they are documented in your case report forms. All right, so we'll move on now to budget and budget justification. So when you're developing your budget, you need to consider the cost of all of the steps in the research study. The format will vary based on the source of your funding, whether this is departmental funding or institutional funding, whether this is an industry-sponsored trial, or from a governmental funding source. So the first step in developing your budget is to work with your institutional offices. Generally, there'll be a clinical trials office that helps to develop the budget for any studies with patient care costs, predominantly industry-sponsored clinical trials. They'll also help with contracting and collection of confidentiality agreements. And then your research grant office helps with developing budgets for governmental and nonprofit grants, as well as many fellowships and career development awards. The core budget components include personnel costs, patient care costs, which is usually done on a per-patient basis, any payments to research subjects, costs involved in space, equipment, and supplies, any travel to study meetings or travel to disseminate the results, administrative costs, and then overhead for your institution. And I'm going to show you just two examples of budget types. So the first is, this is a budget with all of the required fees that are not tied to an individual subject. So IRB submission and the research pharmacy, et cetera. And this is a pretty comprehensive list of all of the fees that may be associated with a study. Not all of them may apply to your particular study. And then you'll also develop a budget for each subject and each visit. So in this spreadsheet, you'll have the amount of costs that will be associated, or the amount of staff time associated with getting informed consent, or collecting the laboratory studies that are required. So we'll have each visit, we'll have whether this procedure is done or not and the amount of cost associated with that. And then at the end, you'll get a total cost per completed patient. And again, your clinical trials office will be very helpful in developing this per patient or per subject type of budget. The second type of budget looks at how much time individual staff will spend on activities related to the research project, and this is defined as percent effort. So, for example, if I thought I would need to spend half a day a week doing activities related to a study, then that would be 10% effort, and this is often turned then into calendar months, so I would spend 1.2 calendar months with my time towards that particular project. And then the other costs are very, very similar, but you'll develop the budget in the aggregate. So for all of the patients that you expect to enroll in the study, what are the patient care costs, what are the supplies and equipment costs, et cetera. And there are some examples of this in the supplemental materials. You'll also need to provide a budget justification, which is a description of the proposed costs, description of the time and effort of the personnel who will be working on the study, any consultants that are going to be participating in the study, and then details of the equipment and supplies and some estimate of the cost for those. You'll also need to provide details of any proposed travel, details of any patient care costs, publication costs, and then any cost of subcontracts or awards, and then your indirect costs for your institution. Again, there are some additional resources on how to write a budget justification. So then finally, I'm going to talk about data and safety monitoring and data sharing. So each proposal will require a data and safety monitoring plan, which is designed to protect participants from harm and make sure that your data is valid. And this is required for all human subjects research studies, but the specific type of monitoring depends on the risk to subjects, the size of the study, and the scope of your study. So for minimal risk, usually the principal investigator just needs to review the study and the data quality and safety at regular intervals and report any problems to the IRB. But for studies that are greater than minimal risk, then you may require an independent medical monitor, or there may need to be a data and safety monitoring board that's appointed by the sponsor, or for investigator-initiated studies, that's an outside independent group of experts who will periodically review the data and any adverse events from the study and determine whether the study should continue. This data and safety monitoring plan requires certain components which are listed here, and there's some examples of how to write a data and safety monitoring plan in the supplemental materials. Finally, a note about the data sharing plan. So this is now required for all NIH grants and many other types of grants as well. Data sharing can include presenting the data at national meetings and publications with a plan for open access, but also submission of the data to public databases that will allow other investigators access to the data for additional analyses. And this should include details of, when the data will be available, what the terms of use will be, the security and the cost of the data sharing. There are also required to talk about how data will be able to be accessed if you're going to make this publicly available. And this is just a list of some components that should be included in the data sharing plan if you do plan to make your data publicly available after the research project is done. And this is a link to the NIH data sharing repositories, which accept data and will provide the framework for data sharing once your study is finished. So in conclusion, the ultimate responsibility for the quality of your research study rests with the principal investigator, with you. You need to make sure that you train your study staff and delegate roles and responsibilities appropriately. A little bit of planning ahead of time minimizes any problems later in your protocol. And unfortunately, I gave you a lot of detail about documentation that's required for clinical research, but this actually ensures that you're going to be collecting data in a valid way that will be appropriate for analysis and publication. Make sure that you monitor your study team and the performance of your study over time, and keep an eye on your budget, monitoring the costs and expenditures of the trial. And thank you very much for your attention.